Explore the fourth pillar of peace. This will be our final episode in the series, and today we are exploring the nature of peace itself. In our prior episodes, we have gone through the deep dive into the nature of trust and what it means to trust ourselves and trust each other. We've gone deep into the nature of truth and what truth is, how truth is expressed. How do we understand truth? How do we pick apart individual truths and collective truths from universal truths? And last time we explored grace, the nature of what it means to open ourselves to the flow of being, becoming, and what it means to surrender to the nature of the power that comes with that divine feminine movement of energy within us. And today, as we explore the nature of peace, we're going to be exploring all of these different pillars and their essential output in rising us up to be more of who we are on earth and in the world at this time. What is peace? What does this word even mean? We have all of these journeys through time and culture, symbols that we've chosen to represent peace. We have this desire for world peace that we talk about. If only we could achieve it, if only we could reach this state of world peace, how much more beautiful would the world be? How much would our lives be different? And we create contexts around this. We say, if we can have peace in the Middle East, if we can have peace in our hearts, if we can have peace among religions, if we can have peace inside of our own families, our own closest relationships, then how can our lives be different and be greater? Well, peace is something that we discover, much like the nature of truth, much like the nature of trust, much like the nature of grace. Peace is in many ways an unfolding experience. It's less about how we define it up front and more about how we experience it within. Each of us has a tremendous capacity for peace and peacemaking. A lot of the episodes in this series, we talk about peacemaking, what it means to make peace with yourself, to address a shadow, to address an issue, to actually grab onto and pinpoint a part of us that's in conflict and begin to alchemize and change the nature of that conflict into a greater state of peace. And this practice of peacemaking, it is really the road to this experience of peace. It says, okay, if you and I are not in agreement, if we are not in the same belief system, if our truths are different, if the level of trust that I have in you or you have in me is imbalanced, what can I do to create more space for us? What can I do to enable there to be more room for your being and my being to exist? Because when I do that, when I say, all right, you have a different perspective than me, but I'm willing to allow there to be space for that perspective to exist, then suddenly I've created the first opportunity for there to be peace within our dynamic. And so we can say energetically, peacemaking is about creating the opportunity for what is already there, the qualities, the personalities, the ideas, and the beliefs to exist. And that it's okay that they exist, and you create space for them. And the space that you create for them probably is gestated by the space you've already created in yourself around the beliefs that you have, around the ideas that you have. When you are tightly contracted around a certain idea, a certain belief system, this is the way it is. This is how it is, because this is what I experienced. That's the way it's got to be. You are strongly prone to conflict. You're right up against it, even when nobody else is even saying anything, even without somebody else even having a different idea. You are right up in direct conjunction with the potential for conflict, because that space of tightness, contraction around your belief or around your idea is not spacious enough for peace to be there. It is ready to make conflict with anyone who believes anything different. Many of us in life, we go through and have experiences with certain individuals where the level at which they hold the intensity around what they think is true gives us a sense already of how easy it's going to be in dynamic with them, and whether we want to be in dynamic with them, whether we want to work with them. And by facing these sort of intense places of holding inside of ourselves, we can begin to kind of unpack that tension point, create more space, and thus create more peace. Now, let's really get tactical about this. If I believe something is strongly true, I'm holding that truth, I'm going into the experience with that truth, and I'm committed to maintaining that truth, then I'm also committed to arguing with others about that truth. I'm committed to defending that truth. I'm committed to essentially doing whatever it takes to maintain control and maintain that truth. If I go into a situation holding my truth lightly, holding my belief lightly, saying, well, this is my experience, but there may be other experiences out there, I've created spaciousness around myself and around my being that enables it to be possible for other people to come to me and say, I actually think it's this way, and this is what I believe, or this is what I've experienced. And when you're like, okay, I'm willing to take that into account in my own exploration. I'm willing to take that into account in how we are in dynamic. Now you can see there's spaciousness, and that spaciousness creates peacefulness. Peacefulness is in many ways about acceptance of possibility, acceptance of the mystery, acceptance of what we don't understand, acceptance of each other. If we look in the greater scope of planetary development, we look at cultures on the planet growing and evolving, where do we see lack of peace? We see a culture moving and growing and going through its own thing, and then something happens. Another culture comes into that same area, and there's a clash. We can use the example of the Roman Empire rolling its way across Europe as a really present example, because it's clear how much impact that had on societies throughout Europe, on cultural ideas and belief systems that exist to this day. It had a tremendous impact. And when we look at it in real detail, what we see is a group of people and beings essentially holding a certain idea about what civilization should look like. What is advancement? What is leading edge versus other things, and gripping very strongly around those ideas that this is what civilization should be, this is what culture should be, and in many cases, this is what religion should be. If you don't believe this, then you're probably on the dark side. You're probably evil. You're probably serving something else that's not good, right? And so you have this highly idea-centric group going across Europe, and what are they coming into contact with? People that live entirely differently to them. People that have a different kind of tribal structure, a different kind of village structure, peoples that paint weird stuff on their faces, peoples that drum and get, deeply into the earth or take medicines from the earth in order to have visions. And this very kind of indigenous and tribal way that was present in a lot of the Germanic tribes across Europe was so vastly different from the structure of the way that the Roman Empire operated, acted, believe is important, believe is useful, that essentially that differentiation created this powerful clash. And so you have this group that essentially believes they're better than the other group, coming in, trying to force things to be their way, because if they can be their way, then there will be peace, right? Then there will be goodness. But essentially the way that plays out is not looking like peace at all. It looks like rape and slaughter and killing and forcing people to operate a different way. It looks like co-opting particular belief systems. It looks like making certain symbols evil. The symbol of Pan, for example, which became our model of the devil, or the symbol of the pentagram, for example, which still to this day, when people share the pentagram, they're like, oh yeah, that's the symbol of devil worshippers, right? And yet this same symbol was a sacred symbol for indigenous peoples across Europe. And all it symbolized was relationship to the earth, to the elements, our connection to fire, air, earth, and water, the recognition of spirit, of life force, of consciousness embedded in and connected to those elements. This symbol literally was the essentially equivalent symbol of God, the same way that the cross may have been for Christians, or the same way that the Star of David is for Judaism, is a sacred symbol about a connection with a divine force. And that divine force literally being seen as the expression of nature in the land, in the winds, in the fire, in the waters that give us life. And so by this sort of opposition of belief systems, you have this clash that essentially makes one way bad and the other way good. And this is essentially the heart and the root of almost all war on the planet. Almost all major conflict has come from this same kind of scenario, where one group believes they're in the right, this is the good way, this is the godly way, this is whatever it is, and this group is the evil way, this is the bad way, these are the belief systems that create trauma and create challenge. And so the good guys seem to go to war against the bad guys, because that's the bad way of being and the bad way of operating. Now, there are, of course, universal ethics and truths that we can look at that are generally acceptable as a universal truth among ways of being and ways of people. Certain universal truths, like that someone should have the right to live without being murdered, that might be one of them. But others have much greater contention among peoples and cultures in the world. For example, the belief that women don't need to cover their face or do need to cover their face, right, is a differentiation between different cultures in the world. Or the belief that, LGBTQ people are good or bad. And yet, those kinds of belief systems, a woman covering her face or not, or someone being gay or queer being good or not, those are limited truths based on cultural perceptions and perspectives often ingrained by religious dogmatism. And those limited truths that are essentially isolated to a particular group have nothing to do with the unfolding natural existence of the universe and life itself. They don't. A person is alive, they have an idea, they have a preference, they have a desire, they are a person. There is nothing in any kind of natural law or universal law that would have anything to do with whether someone covers their face or not. And there's nothing in universal or natural law that we can see that has anything to do with whether someone's sexual preference should have anything to do with whether others judge them or not, right? These kinds of things, those kinds of beliefs break the spaciousness that comes with acknowledging the sovereignty of choice of the individual. Now, sovereignty of choice of individual is really important when we talk about peacemaking, because essentially what you're looking at is what is right for you should be okay for you. If that is right for you, it should be okay for you. And some of the traditions, and I'll point to one for the sake of our model of analysis that we were using a moment ago, inside of essentially some of the Germanic tribes and traditions that were in Europe that were taken over by the Roman Empire and in many ways wiped out by Christianity. And one of the statements that those groups would use is essentially the root of what became the Wiccan Rede. And it's also related to essentially the Golden Rule, which is the same thing in Christianity's perspective. And that rede is that, and thou harm none, do what thy will. And what this means is that you can choose whatever is right for you, as long as you're not hurting somebody else. So whether you cover your face or not, whatever your sexual preference is, whatever the color of your skin is, whatever way you like to eat, the way you like to meditate, the way you like to sleep, the way you like to do things for yourself and with yourself, that is essentially up to you. And that you should, in any case, have the freedom within your own space to make those choices and do those actions. Now, this is really interesting because if we accept that and we allow for that, we sort of give that the universal mechanics that it is due. In other words, we are all individual beings choosing our experience. So shouldn't we be able to choose what is right and what is good for us? Absolutely, yes. If we give space for that, suddenly there's a huge reduction in conflict, because essentially we're creating that spaciousness around what it means to be an individual that's enough to allow peace to occur. So yeah, there's this guy or this girl over here, and they have their particular way that they do things. And, maybe it's irritating, maybe it bothers us sometimes, maybe it's weird to us, but it's their way. And it's our choice how much we're in relationship with that person, but it's their choice how they want to live and how they want to be. And the more we respect that desire in the other person, the more we honor that choice that someone else is making for them and that is right for them and that is good for them, the more we actually feel good. And the more we actually feel okay, the less irritated we are, the less challenged we are, the less triggered we are, because we create space. And that same space comes back to us. It's actually part of what enables there to be coexistence and for me to be who I am, for you to be who you are, and for that to be okay, and for the ways that you like to live and eat and work and choose and do what you do to be okay. And that is a foundation for peacemaking, sovereignty, the individual choice of the individual to be who they are. As long as they're not harming somebody else, as long as they're not forcing on somebody else, hurting somebody else by that choice, that is okay, that what they choose is okay. Now, there's mechanics that become issues here. So the idea of like, well, does them choosing for themselves hurt me, or does that hurt somebody else if I don't like what they do, right? Well, I'd say there's a pretty clear line that says you have the choice to either be living in the same zone as somebody else or being or in the same space as somebody else. And a lot of that has to do with community boundaries and community truths. So if you don't really agree with the way that other people are living and you don't think that that's the right way for you, it's probably a good idea for you to find your community, the people that you do want to live with, that live in the way that you want to live. And then you're generally going to be in greater harmony. Now, of course, how the community decides what is right and wrong and good and bad and enforces that and expresses that, the more contraction there is around sovereignty. In other words, the less freedom that the individuals have to be who they are and express what they want to have within that community, the higher the likelihood there is of conflict, because that's just the nature of interpersonal dynamics. And so the communities that contract a lot are going to have a lot of conflict. And some people just are inclined to being in states and being in communities that are full of conflict. Others have more respect, more freedom, more acknowledgement of individual will, desire, more spaciousness for that. And those communities in general are going to be more okay with different people's choices and how they've made them and what they're doing with them, as long as they're not hurting others with them. And that's going to create a huge amount of spaciousness and a huge amount of peace. So how do we get there at a planetary level? Well, part of it is doing exactly what we've been doing in this conversation, this dialogue, this monologue by Adam Apollo, downloading to you, essentially, my thoughts on this. I wish it was more of a conversation, but we'll get there. And so it's about literally looking at the spaciousness we create around belief systems and communities, and understanding how they're making their own choices, that the community body, in a sense, is sovereign on its own. And if we can create spaciousness to say that way of being is okay, the way that they're choosing to be is their choice, then suddenly we create a peaceful relationship between ourselves or our community with that community. We are essentially issuing a field of peace, which is got enough room for them to be whoever they are. It's beautiful. And it's an extension of trust. It says, I'm willing to trust that you are who you are and that that's okay. Now, if that community that you're extending that trust to breaks that trust by conflict, violent action, doing things where people are getting hurt, well, that can be much more difficult, because now you can still be accepting that they are who they are and they're choosing what they choose, but you may not be willing to be in relationship with that community anymore because of its behavior, because of its dynamics, because of the way that it's hurting people. And this is essentially the heart of the dilemma that we're in at a planetary scale. We've already made the judgments in many cases where this people in this country or this westernized culture has this belief and this perception about this other culture or this other community and group of people on the planet. Because people got hurt, stuff went down, people are getting killed, people are getting murdered, this is happening, that is happening. So those groups are so difficult to see how we can work with it, that essentially we're not in a peacemaking approach anymore. We're in a war approach. We're in a how do we defend ourselves from those crazy people, right? How do we stop them from destroying us and our way of life? Well, here's where the spiritual story goes a little deeper, because when we start to look at those dynamics, we start to look at the will within an individual or within a community to hurt others, to create pain, to take us out of peace, to enter into conflict. That is usually stimulated by trauma. And we talked a lot about peacemaking in general and peacemaking as a whole. If we don't address the root trauma and the conflicts that was created initially, then we're not going to get back there. We're not going to get back to the state of peace that probably existed before that. And in many cases in the world, the trauma had to do with invasion, hurting people, weaponization, military conquest, just like the Roman Empire through Europe. It's happened in many places. It's happened in North America, armies rolling across and trying to take out the indigenous tribes. It happens, it's happened many times all over the world. And it's certainly happened in the Middle East, if we use that example, where there's been a lot of instantiation of control. And why? To control resources, to control oil, to control wealth, to gain access to some of the wealth in these regions. And many cultures have been literally abused and their rights taken from them, their sovereignty taken from them. And that creates a backlash in time. That backlash is that those wounds are passed to children. Those wounds are what people grow up with. And those wounds create this anonymity, this anger and this pain to fight back against the oppressor, to take down that which has essentially oppressed you, has essentially pushed you down, that has taken your sovereignty from you. And this is where a lot of our conflict comes from, because as soon as there's a strike back, at the oppressor usually is like, oh, we're the victims. We're the ones being hurt. So we're going to put all of our military force on there. And this is how a lot of wars have started. This is how a lot of our global conflict has occurred. And the reality is that consciousness is evolving. We are all progressing in our communication, in our awareness, in our historical consciousness. And we're starting to, because we're all connected as a planet, be able to perceive these very subtle dynamics of how exactly we got into these wars and these conflicts in the first place. We can see it now. We can get it. We have the capacity to record and understand and look at linear progression and see cause and effect at a level that we've never been able to before. And what does that mean? That means that through that lens, we can account for the root of trauma. We can account for the roots of conflict. And that also means that the culture, the oppressors, the military organizations, the countries, the nation states that have been part of causing these conflicts have to essentially make reparations to heal the root trauma. And that is not easy to do. That is often a complicated process. And we can look at the United States and North America as a really good example of this, and essentially say, all right, is it enough to create a Native American history museum in Washington, D.C.? Does that just make it okay that like all these indigenous people were forced into reservations and land stolen from them? And in many of these reservations, they're essentially ghettos. They have very little access to like good resources and healthy food. There's usually low money. Oftentimes monetization is created through the creation of casinos and gambling, which has then created its own issues and addictive problems. And it's just a mess. And no, you can't just fix that by making a museum. You can't just repair it that way. You have to actually take acknowledgement as a country. We have to speak to the issue. And especially the challenge is that it's not the same people. It's not the same people who took those lands and raped the women and pushed the indigenous into different, essentially concentration camps that they've still been stuck in, that we call reservations, over all of these years, you know. And it's different people that are in government now. It's different people who are making the decisions, different people in new positions making acknowledgement. And so because it's different people, those new people have to take account and recognize that there are still issues and there are still challenges and still conflicts that exist because there hasn't been healing of these fundamental traumas. So how do you get there? Really deep listening. It requires counsel. It requires acknowledgement of those peoples in the highest forms of United Councils, United Nations, in the US government. There needs to be counsel with Indigenous elders because they are part of this nation. They are nations within this nation, just as important and valuable as the states formed by other people, usually some white guys, you know? And so the healing is about actually incorporating the understanding of what can make it right, what can heal these communities, what can make improvements. And then together we can actually innovate on how to actually improve things and make a deal that works for everybody. Some deals that improve reservations, that open up land, that change dynamics between governing bodies or states and the indigenous peoples living within those states. It's literally about transforming the structure of our culture to operating with the full spaciousness, the full context of what happened in the past and what's happening now, with the potential of what can happen in the future. And I believe that this is also the mechanism that's required in many places like the Middle East, but needs to have the level of care and compassion and framing that it is not hidden that there were weapons sold to these groups that are now called terrorists, where it is not hidden that there was invasions and certain things that happened in the past, but where those things are acknowledged. This takes, in a way, almost like historical peacemakers, people who have understood the lineage and passage of time and the conflicts that have been existing between people, to come forward as the new form of philosopher that essentially is providing an understanding of the landscape of how we got to here, and helping to facilitate the conversation of how do we make reparations? How do we heal the traumas? How do we heal these wounds between us? It is an age in which now we need literally geomantic healers, healers of the earth, those that are willing to step up and look at the tides of culture and countries and look at how we can heal and repair these things. And you know what? It's not going to come from those that are like, we need to shut down the borders and close down and hit those terrorists hard. And that is the same kind of behavior that got us into the mess in the first place. It is the behavior of contraction, of judgment, of lack of recognition of sovereignty and cultural choice, the lack of the cultural anthropological sort of sense of understanding and being and lenses of perspective. We need new kinds of leadership now. And those new kinds of leadership, I think, in many cases, are individuals that have nothing to do with politics. They're individuals that have just been doing this deep inner work, looking at our planet, looking at what's happened and how we got to here. And in many cases, they don't know where to put their voice. They don't know where to bring that to light. And hopefully they're publishing books. Hopefully they're publishing papers. Hopefully they're getting that voice out there. But I think we're really coming up to a time period in which there is a deep need within the political spectrum, within the collective public narrative, for these voices to come forward and begin to talk about these issues, to bring these dynamics to light, to bring healing forward as a mission and a process, as an achievable goal for mankind, for all of our people on earth together. And I'll just say that it's piece by piece, piece with piece, that we make it happen. Many people around this world, all over this earth, in literally every country on the planet, in literally every nation state, everywhere, already operate from this lens of healing, from this lens of peacemaking. They feel already that they are part of a global interconnected culture. If you're watching this, you're one of my audience, you're probably already in this boat. And you're probably like, yeah, I already know this. Of course, it's just Apollo. He's just going off on his thing again that I know. But I like it and I hear it and I appreciate it. Thanks. I love you guys. And you probably are already at the level that you're saying, yeah, I know. Like we get it. We want this global connected community. It's not one nation as a planet, essentially. It's one community of many, many, many nations, many, many ways of being. And together, yes, we form a transcendent planetary nation, a nation of people of all colors and races and beliefs and spectrums, in which we are co-creating the journey of stewardship of Earth. And that's what it's going to take, as I talk about sometimes, to become compatible with many of the other galactic civilizations out there that have established planetary stewardship, that have established an understanding that their race and their culture is diverse and is vast, but there's enough sovereignty to allow for enough interconnectedness and enough peace for all of it to be okay and all of it to exist. And then you can really start taking stewardship of your planet, your biosphere, the way that you operate, the way that you engage. And we need that. We need that on Earth. We need that world peace. We need that global peace. And to get there, this community that already gets it, all of you guys listening to this, it's up to you to bring your voice forward in how we can do that. It's up to you to recognize and acknowledge where we're operating out of judgment, where we're operating out of semi or lack of understanding of certain cultural contexts and traditions, where we may be operating out of awareness of trauma and the roots of the conflict that exist, and to do the work to get in there deeper, to actually start to engage with where does this conflict come from? Where is the pattern originate? Where did this start? And how do we get back to that seed, that root point, and start to apply the salve there, start to apply the healing there? What are the kinds of communications that we can do with our friends, with our family, with our social media efforts to actually start to bridge an understanding and say, you know, it's not about Russians. It's not about Ukrainians. They're just people. It's about the choices that certain leaders have made, certain military forces have made. It's about the choices and the agendas being made by those that are operating within a trauma construct of some kind, operating within a reactive, controlling, judgmental space that's operating and trying to control the narrative and trying to essentially reduce sovereignty, which essentially is going to reduce peace. And we have to recognize that there's a lot of beings that are in that place. There are a lot of people still operating in these places of conflict making, trauma, division, left versus right, red versus blue, this versus that. And they're so contracted around the idea that this is the way, that everywhere they go, they're making conflict with everything that's not that way. So we got to make a new way, a transcendent, something above red versus blue, the purple, you know, the white, the thing that looks at both sides of the issue and says, you know what, I think a lot of people would agree with me that whether you're Republican or whether you're Democrat, red versus blue, right? That most people that I've talked to that are identify with one or the other, they want to have freedom from the manipulation of their government, right? They want to conserve, in a sense, their freedom, conservative. They want to have the ability to make their own choices and claim their sovereignty as peoples, right? This is essentially the heart of the Republican narrative. It's about not giving the government all your money. It's about controlling your ability for freedom of choice and having that. And guess what? Most people want that. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican or what the heck you identify with, right? Now, on the other side, you've got this desire that most people also have, this sort of democratic desire that says, hey, we need good school systems. We got to teach our kids, like, this is our kids' education and future that we're talking about. Like, we kind of need good roads. You know, we should really try to work on the student debt issue, because how many people's lives suffer because of debt? You know, we should be looking at how to help people at the bottom and homeless people and actually create better systems for support in our nation. Why? Because when you help people that are in need and need support and they become productive creators in society again, it improves, creates more wealth for everybody in the whole country. It's people are literally creating life, just like educated kids create better, make better entrepreneurs, you know, and better global citizens. These are important things. And it doesn't matter whether you're red or blue, you generally will agree with those ideas. And you'll generally have gone through situations where you have needs on both sides. And so there becomes this fertile ground for the arising of something new in our time. And this arising that can happen essentially looks like independence. And our country is founded on the idea of independence. And independence, as in like the Declaration of Independence, is the forging factor that can enable there to be an independent movement in the United States, an independent movement, which there's already a context for. And in fact, it turns out that well over half of all the people in this country already identify as independent people anyway. They just tend to, check the Republican or the Democrat box in order to get in a certain candidate, because usually they're so scared of the other candidate. They're so freaked out by the other candidate's behavior or actions or age or sickness or ideals or whatever, that they're just reacting and trying to vote for the other party, right? This is the kind of thing that we're in that is essentially at the heart of our challenges around peace and actually making the world we want it to be. And it does come down to, in many ways, transforming our representative democracy. It's not just a solution to say, hey, we all get to vote and there's people that we vote in and gosh, that just solves all the problems. No, we are now in essentially what my friend Christopher Live calls a duopoly in the United States, where there is agendas so deeply ingrained and financial systems so deeply ingrained that it's built to divide us. It's built to create conflict. And the only way we're going to pierce through that is if we as a collective, as a planetary family, begin to really rise up those movements that are transcendent of those issues. That we take on the great responsibility as individuals to stand for values that unify us, the values and the ethics that are important to all of us, right? That aren't just isolated to one religion or one belief system or, one particular aspect of the dynamic of the issues that we always debate about. I think this, I think that. Well, okay. So how do you guys make a bridge? How do you meet in the middle? How do we make this work for all of us? All win, for all life, for all mankind, for all life. Not just mankind, but every kind of being, humans, animals, trees, forests, ocean life, biosystems, planetary bodies, right? How do we make it work for everyone? Whatever your race, whatever your gender, whatever your species, right? This is the practice that we're in. This is the real work of peace and peacemaking. And I believe that we're in a place right now that has so much potential to do so much good if we're willing to step outside of the divisions and the conflict, step outside of our judgments of organizations or individuals or whatever, thinking that, whatever. Like, stand for what's good, stand for what's true, stand for what's real, and how we can balance and be in greater harmony with each other. And that means standing for the recognition that others have different truths, the recognition that we have to extend trust at times, the recognition that we have to operate with grace, with graciousness, when we're feeling the tension of conflict, that we have to create space around ourselves and our choices and our way of being, and space around others, and that these are the pillars of peace. These are the ways that we can actually build a foundation for world peace on this planet and extend that connecting into a galactic community of peace as we go beyond this world. So with that, I leave you on this 4-episode series. I hope that if you've enjoyed this one, if you haven't heard some of the others, please check them out. Hopefully they'll form nice little adventures for you in the evenings or when you're relaxing or just want to listen to some philosophy and some ideas about how we can work on ourselves, develop ourselves, and be in greater service to each other and to the world. Thank you again so much. My name is Adam Apollo. It's an honor and pleasure to be with you. And if you want to find more of my videos, they're all around on YouTube. You can Google my name and find my website, and feel free to reach out to me. I'd love your comments, your feedback, and your ideas. Obviously, within the scope of these, I can drop parts of the whole picture, but I'm doing my best to bring as much of the picture to the table as possible for us to explore together. Thank you for your time. Blessed be.